Okay, we are live on YouTube.
Thanks. Welcome to all. Thanks for the organizer of these things. Today we have Ivette Perfecto offering sharing knowledge about the topic of landscape of justice, agroecology, nature metrics, and food sovereignty. This conference is mainly for the student of the International Master Program on Climate Change and Diversity, Sustainable Territorial Development, but is open to general public interested to the topic. We are very happy to have here Ivette. Ivette is Banyan Bryant Collegiate Professor of Environmental Justice in the School of Environment and Sustainability in University of Michigan. She teaches globalization and its discontent struggles for food, water, and energy, and diverse farming system. She is the co-author of a very important book, Nature Metrics Linking Agriculture, Conservation, Food Sovereignty. The first edition was of 2009 and a new edition of 2019. Another interesting book is Breakfast of Biodiversity, the Political Ecology of Rainforest Destruction, and another more recent book on Ecological Complexity and Agroecology of 2018. Ivette has a long trajectory on interdisciplinary research between North and Central and South America, and the double communication working in English and Spanish, and a strong connection with research and activism. She has a long study on the role of ants, the contribution to research, practice, and movement on agroecology. He has a research laboratory in Puerto Rico. She prepared some years ago, in 2015, a gameplay on Azteca chess and agrobiodiversity, a tool to explore the functional biodiversity in agroecosystem. I want to cite some article to give you the picture of the topics of research involving Ivette. In 1992, she wrote an article in Race and Class on pesticide exports to the third world. In 1995, Rethinking Rainforest, Biodiversity and Social Justice. So the topic of social justice is key in the work of Ivette. Then research on shade coffee in 96. In 97, the agroecosystem, a need for conservation biologist lens. Then I want to cite in 2005, the future of farming and conservation in science. In 2009, an article in Spanish, La soberanía alimentaria cultivando nuevas alianzas entre campo, bosque y ciudad. In 2014, biodiversity conservation in agriculture require a multi-scale approach. In 2021, human dimension, agroecology for just and sustainable food system, again justice, and 2024, momentum for agroecology in USA. The conference will focus on the innovative concept of a nature metric. It's not innovative because Ivette worked in this topic almost 20 years ago, but mainly it is innovative in the world of biology, in the world of conservation, because the approach is very closed just to the issue of biodiversity sometimes. And she worked on the challenges of agroecological transition, food sovereignty, social environmental justice, biodiversity, cultural diversity, and the co-construction of knowledge. We are very happy to have Ivette here. Many thanks. I let you the floor, Ivette.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to be here today with such a diverse audience from all over the world. I'm gonna talk, as Massimo say, about landscapes of justice, agroecology, nature's matrix, and food sovereignty. And as Massimo mentioned, this has a lot to do also with biodiversity. So I'm gonna start by talking about this report, which was published a long time ago, more than 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago, actually, called Our Common Future. The World Commission on Environment and Development was commissioned to do this report. And basically, the question that they were asking at the time was, how can we conserve the environment for future generations and still satisfy the human population need for food, energy, shelter, etc. No? Now, this question emerged because it was becoming very evident that the industrial agricultural system had tremendous impact on the environment. And so we all know about, the consequences of this kind of industrial system. And one of the major consequences is the loss of biodiversity. Actually, this kind of agriculture is the main driver of the loss of biodiversity. You're probably familiar with the headlines related to the declines of insects, for example, insect abundance and diversity. Like this article that I'm putting here, the cover, that was published in the New York Times Magazine. And despite the very sensationalistic title of the insect apocalypse, they basically cite a lot of evidence that insects are indeed declining all over the world. This is one of the studies coming from Europe, for example. It was published in 2018 by a European team in Germany. And this study report that more than 75% of the insects were lost in a period of about 3 decades. And here you can see the data that's published in that study. For those of you who are not familiar with this study, you can see that they did some sampling in 1990 and then throughout 2016 or something like that. And you can see the decline in biodiversity or biomass, in this particular case, biomass of insects. And here you see throughout the season, because there's some seasonality, of course, that have an effect on insect abundance, but you can see the blue dots represent the first sampling that they did in the 90s. And then toward the bottom here, you can see the orange dots that represent the sampling that was done in the 2010s and throughout the 2016. Also, according to a study by Rodolfo Dirso from Stanford University, of all the insects with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that have documented population trends, 33% are declining. In some orders, like the Orthoptera, for example, almost 100% of those insects that they're following up on their populations have declined. And in the order Coleoptera, which are the beetles, more than 60% have been declining. So we have this tremendous decline in the diversity and the abundance of the insects. And of course, this is really important because insects provide very important ecosystem services. They're pollinators, they are biological pest control agents, they are decomposers of organic matter, they aerate the soil, etc., etc. No? So they are very important. The other thing is that insects are also food for other organisms, like the birds. And so after the insects are gone, the birds also start disappearing. And we're left with, to quote the famous Rachel Carson, we're left with a silent spring, like, those prophetic words of Rachel Carson. So, for example, studies from Europe, like I'm showing here, in Denmark and France, there were studies that show that birds had declined by 1/3. And in some regions of France, they have documented that birds have declined by 2/3. So there's a tremendous decline. And here in North America, the situation is very similar. A study published by Kenneth Rosenberg and his colleagues from the Cornell Ornithological Laboratory in 2019 estimated that since 1970, almost 3 billion birds have disappeared. 3 billion birds. And most of these are insectivorous birds. showing the relationship between the disappearance of the insects and the disappearance of the birds. And here you can see the population decline of birds by almost 3 billions. And these are primarily insectivores. So these are the birds that basically they're insects. The insects are essential for their diet. The ones that don't eat that many insects actually are faring okay. They have not declined, and if anything, have increased a little bit. Again, this is a demonstration of the impact that the disappearance of the insects have on other organisms. Here you can see a publication that came from the Chatham House and the United Nations Environmental Program about 2 or 3 years ago by Tim Benton and colleagues. And this is a quote from this report that is called Food System Impacts on Biodiversity Loss. And they say, our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, with agriculture alone being the identified threat to 20,000 of the 28,000, or that's representative of 86% species at risk of extinction. The global rate of species extinction today is higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years. So we're losing biodiversity, we're losing the abundance of organisms in our planet, and agriculture is basically the driver of that primarily. Here you can see a study that was published last year in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Science. This was bird populations in Europe as well, and essentially they were able to identify and sort out with a very sophisticated statistical analysis, sort out that the main culprit for the decline of birds in Europe was essentially the high input farming systems. So all the pesticides that we're applying basically to these systems that are monocultural systems, they look at amount of forest cover, the trend in forest cover, they look at urbanization, and urbanization also had a significant impact. And they look also at temperature as a measurement of climate change, and those didn't have that much impact. And this is, I don't know if you're familiar with this study. I think it's a really important study that was published several years ago that basically show that people have shaped most of the terrestrial nature for at least 12,000 years. And what I want you to look at here is these two bands here, the gray and the light blue bands, represent basically the wild lands in our planet going back 12,000 years. And you can see what is really impressive of this is that it has changed actually very little. The amount of wildland, completely wildlands, have changed very, very little throughout time. Of course, it has declined somewhat, but what has changed primarily is the way that we're using that land, no? So the way that agriculture have been intensified throughout, especially after the Industrial Revolution, and especially so after World War II. And so this is a quote from that article, and they say, even 12,000 years ago, nearly 3/4 of the Earth's land was inhabited and therefore shaped by human societies, including more than 95% of the temperate and 90% of the tropical woodlands. Lands now characterized as natural, intact, and wild generally exhibit long histories of use, as do protected areas in indigenous lands. And then they conclude by saying that the current biodiversity crisis can seldom be explained by the loss of uninhabited wildlands, resulting instead from the appropriation, colonization, and intensifying use of biodiverse cultural landscapes, long shaped and sustained by prior societies. Recognizing this deep cultural connection with biodiversity will therefore be essential to resolve the crisis. And of course, they're talking about the biodiversity crisis. Now, we don't see this kind of thinking reflected that much in many of the policies that are being implemented. For example, the Convention of Biological Diversity, if you look at Target 3, which is the one that most people are talking about, this is the so-called 30 by 30, no? This is conserving 30% of the land, oceans, and other bodies of water by the year 2030, which is, you know, in a few years, essentially. And the problem that I see with this approach is that it basically focus on protected areas, even though I have to recognize that the other targets that there are about, I don't know, something like 12 or 13 targets, something like that. I don't remember the entire list of all the targets, but a lot of those other targets are related to how we manage the areas outside the protected areas. But this target is specifically about protected areas, essentially. And so basically establishing protected 30% of the land in protected areas. And my question then is, what about the other 70%? When we have this focus on protected areas, we basically are, to some extent, giving a license for anything to happen outside those reserves. So one criticism that I have of conservation biologists and conservationists in general is this emphasis on protected areas, because, you know, as long as these certain areas are protected, and protected from whom, we have to ask, no? But as long as they're protected, then anything else can happen outside those areas. I see a lot of failures related to this approach, the protected areas approach, and mainly there is a history of displacement and violation of human rights. As I mentioned from the other article that talk about the 12,000 years of humans using this earth, there's a lot of conservation of natural areas and biodiversity in areas that are managed by human beings, and especially indigenous people. And so the focus on protected areas historically, although you know, there has been some progress made in this respect, but historically it has displaced a lot of people from their lands and causing a lot of violation of human rights. Now, even though this doesn't happen as often as it used to happen, it still happens. And there are people being displaced continuously from their lands. There are, for example, the Maasai are being displaced from areas that the government want to use for tourism, for ecotourism. And so this is just an example of many that you can find in the literature that are currently going on, violations of human rights that are currently going on in the name of protected areas. And then the other thing is that frequently they don't work as intended. So there are studies that have shown how these areas actually do not result in the conservation of biodiversity. I mean, you can find both situations where the establishment of a protected area has resulted in the conservation of biodiversity, but many other studies that show that they do not. And so, you know, in some circumstances, they could potentially have resulted in, especially in the conservation of certain species, but overall, the protected areas approach do not work as intended. And this is just a graph that shows the amount of protected areas through time. So starting in 1970 all the way to 10, 15 or 17, something like that. And you can see that the different regions of the world. No, you see Africa, Latin America, Asia, etc. And so the number or the total percentage of area that is under protection, have increased dramatically. But then when you look at basically the living, whoops, I cannot read this. Living Planet Index, which is an indication of how much of that diversity actually has been maintained, you see that essentially that is declining for all regions of the world. Not just the global south, but the global north as well. And so these protected areas, we're putting more and more and more land in protected areas, but they're not achieving the results that are intended. Now, that leads me then to talk a little bit about the land sparing approach, because the idea here is that we can intensify agricultural systems. So let me move into this. Increasing yields and intensifying areas that are farmed already will require less land because you can produce more food in less area. And that will then lead to the sparing of land that can be used for conservation. So that's the idea of the land sparing approach. So therefore, natural habitat will be spared, and this former farmland can be restored back to natural habitat. And so land sparing, I see a lot of problems with the land sparing approach. The land sparing approach assumes high yields in intensify agricultural system and a high production of food that people eat in this intensify agricultural system. And therefore the ability to produce more in less land and the possibility of sparing the land for conservation. But there are a lot of problems with this approach. I'm sorry, I didn't intend to put that there, but let's continue. So we already produce enough food to feed the world, or for people, to enough food to supply the food that is needed for the global population. Actually, we produce more than enough at this moment. Agricultural intensification rarely leads to land sparing. That means that, and this has been studied empirically, that when you establish an agricultural intensification program, that doesn't lead to land sparing. If anything, it actually leads to more deforestation rather than less deforestation. And then you have that land sparing assume a sharp trade-off between agricultural production and biodiversity conservation. So it gives the impression that you have either to intensify land and to be able to produce enough food and conserve biodiversity. So with the land that you spare, you conserve biodiversity. Also, that conventional intensification has a very it ignores the fact that conventional intensification has a very large environmental cost and actually result eventually on the loss of the productivity in those areas. And finally, the land sparing approach ignores the dynamic nature of biodiversity and the importance of the agricultural matrix. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the rest of the talk, about this particular aspect of the critique of the land sparing argument. Okay, so most habitats today in the world are fragmented, with some exception of big chunks of areas of natural habitats that are still left. If we're talking about tropical rainforest, the Congo Basin, in the Amazon, and to some extent also in Southeast Asia, there are still some relatively big chunks of forests that are left. But most of the habitats are actually fragmented, like what you see here in this aerial photograph from Campo Grande in Brazil. And so the darker areas here represent patches of forest embedded in a matrix of agricultural lands, And that's how most of the habitats are today. Now, it's important to realize that there are three arguments for this, the nature matrix argument that we make in our book. First of all, local extinctions are natural events and happen even in continuous or undisturbed habitats. So, for example, here you see a fragment of forest, no? This is embedded in a matrix of soybean. This is in Brazil. So in this patch of forest, essentially you're going to have extinctions that are going to happen. However, if those extinctions can be either prevented or they can, the population can get reestablished in those areas with migration. So if organisms can travel through the matrix and get to this patch, then you're going to have, basically that particular species can recolonize the area. So local extinctions are natural events. They are constantly happening. And even if this was a continuous forest, you're going to have, because populations are usually clustered, no? And you're going to have populations that get extinct, even in a big patch of forest. But then that area gets recolonized by organisms that migrate from another part of the forest, no? So there is this immigration from other patches, in this case in particular, because this is embedded in an agricultural matrix and it's not a continuous forest. So from other patches, there has to be some migration or immigration to these patches for the population not to go extinct. And the number of species in this patch will be the result of this dynamic of immigration and extinction. So biodiversity is dynamic, and you have the process of extinction happening normally, naturally, and you need to have some recolonization of those species in those patches for them not to go extinct. This is based on the metapopulation theory that was developed long time ago by Richard Levins, where basically he define a metapopulation as a collection of spatially separated subpopulations of the same species that are connected through immigration. So you can have extinction going on in these patches, but then that species basically recolonize those areas where the population have gone extinct, and the population as a whole can be maintained as a metapopulation, no? And this is the metapopulation equation here. And what I want you to notice here is a very simple equation. The number of patches that are occupied by the species is going to be equal to 1 minus EM. So this ratio here is the important one, no? This ratio here is extinction over the immigration. If extinction is the same as immigration, then essentially you have if extinction is the same as immigration, you have 1 here, and 1 minus 1 is 0, and so you have 0 patches. Eventually, the population is going to go extinct. And obviously, when E is the extinction is higher than the immigration, then you're going to have extinction eventually in the population. So let me give you an example actually from here, from where I am, Michigan. This is the E.S. George Reserve in Michigan. Is an area of forest with some patches of, this is not all growth forest because all of the forest was cut here at some point in time. But this is a fairly well-developed secondary forest. And there are a lot, because of the history of glaciation in this region of the world, there are a lot of ponds in this area. And so Skelly, Warner, and Calbright did a study where they basically sample all the ponds in the George Reserve, in this reserve, and they and then they did the survey in many years later. So the initial survey was done from 1967 to 1974, and then they did again the resampling of this area from 1988 to 1992. And what they found was that there were a number of extinctions of amphibians, mostly frogs, tadpoles, in these ponds, no? So you have, here is the number of extinction for the different kinds of ponds. But nevertheless, the overall populations of all the species of frogs that were there remained the same. So they didn't, in that period of time, no species was lost. No, even though there were a lot of local extinctions, like shown here, these were all local extinctions in particular ponds, but then there were recolonizations and migration from one pond to another pond. And so these basically migrations or immigration basically counteracted the extinctions. And so no species was lost in this area. Now, this is a picture of one of the small ponds. This is in the winter, so there's no leaves on the trees, but essentially this is an area that is a forested area, very well conserved forest area. And so you know, in these areas, you have then the amphibians migrating from one pond to another, constantly moving between ponds, no? And that happens because this matrix is you know, a friendly matrix for them. They can easily move around. However, you can imagine if the matrix was something like this. This is a golf course, also in Michigan, right next to where this is in the spring, so you have more, you know, vegetation and all that. But the point here is that this is alone grasses that are managed intensively with a lot of herbicide, with a lot of pesticide. And so the amphibians that are living in these ponds are going to have a very hard time moving from one pond to another pond. No, they're going to experience a lot of mortality during that process of moving around, and overall, over the entire area, if the entire area consists of something like this, a matrix consists of something like this, then you're going to have extinctions that will turn into more regional extinctions. So that's the concept of the matrix dynamics. Without immigration, local extinctions that are natural and are happening all the time will turn into regional extinctions. And those regional extinctions could turn into global extinctions eventually. And so in this particular case that I showed you before with the patch of forest here, there's several patches of forest back here. Let's suppose that we have a little frog that lives in this patch, and that frog species go extinct locally in this patch of forest. Well, what's going to happen, what can happen potentially, is that frogs of that species that live in these patches here could potentially migrate to this patch and recolonize it. But could they? You know, the question is, what is the quality of that agricultural matrix where these patches of forest are embedded? And of course, if you have a matrix like this, which is monoculture of soybean, potentially this is more very likely to be GMO soybean with the application of a lot of herbicide that have been proved to be fatal for amphibians. The probability that a little frog, at least two, because you need the male and the female, are going to be able to make it to this patch of forest is very low, no? So the main idea here is that the quality of the matrix is important. So contrast that matrix that I show you here, the soybean monocultural plantation in Brazil, with this coffee matrix, shaded coffee landscape in Chiapas, Mexico, which is where I work. I do a lot of research here in this region in particular. And so here, what you see in this landscape are three patches of forest. This is a patch of forest, this is a patch of forest, and this is a patch of forest here. In between, what you have is an agricultural matrix of shaded coffee. And this is what the fragment of forest look like in this region. And this is what the coffee farm, the shaded coffee farm looks like in this region. And so essentially this little species, this little frog, it's not going to have a lot of trouble basically navigating or migrating, moving through this agricultural matrix to get to another patch of forest, no? And so that's the idea of nature's matrix, that the quality of that agricultural system that is surrounding these areas, these patches of natural areas that are left in the world, of which there are billions of them, that matrix is going to be responsible for whether or not the organisms can be maintained as a metapopulation with that migration, no? The dynamics of migration and extinction. And so in a good quality matrix like this shaded coffee farm, you're going to have a lot of movement, no? From the patches of forest through the matrix to another patch of forest. Now, there are some species that can easily live in the matrix, in the agricultural matrix. However, there are species that might be very, very tied to particular habitats. And, there might be some very strict forest specialists that live in this patch of forest. However, this matrix, even though might not be a place for that population to get established and be able to reproduce and live there for a very long period of time, nevertheless, it allows the movement of that species from one fragment of forest to another fragment of forest, no? And so, so that then the population can be maintained as a meta-population. So again, here's the shaded coffee farm, and here's the sun monoculture. The point here is that the matrix matter. What is that kind of agriculture? How is that agriculture that is surrounding those patches of forest? That is really important for the conservation of biodiversity at the landscape level. And about 70% of the land in our planet is in these kinds of intensive agriculture, not of the land, of the agricultural land. About 70% of the agricultural land is this kind of agriculture. Very large, intensive monocultural plantations. And that means that we have very, very low quality matrices. And even though these areas might require the farmers to leave patches of forest embedded within those agricultural landscapes, eventually those populations are going to go extinct, no? And they would not be able to be recolonized because they're embedded in these kinds of agricultural matrices. Now, small-scale diverse agroecological farms are more prone to allow that migration between the fragments of forest. There are other issues that need to be considered, like people using that wildlife for food or killing the animals because they're afraid of them, or there are some issues that we need to deal with, obviously, but just looking at the type of vegetation that's there, these kinds of matrices will allow more migration to patches of forest, and therefore the maintenance of a metapopulation. Now, how can we transform these kinds of landscape to these kinds of landscapes? No, that would be the objective, to transform all these areas, that 70% of the agricultural land that is in these kinds of very intensive monocultural farms, into this very diverse type of landscape. And we know how to do that, technically speaking. There are a lot of examples in the world of these very diverse farming systems and agroforestry systems, et cetera, et cetera. But the people that are making the decisions to make those sorts of systems are the farmers themselves, no? And so obviously this is more of a political question than a technical question, because we know how to do agriculture in that way. There might be some details that we need to still understand, and we still need to understand more of the ecology of those systems, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, the political aspects of how to make that transformation is a very important one. Now, fortunately, or the good news is that agroecology and diverse farming systems are being embraced by millions of farmers, especially in the global south, where a large population of or a large proportion of the population is still directly connected to the land and where most biodiversity is located, no? And so here you see, for example, that small-scale farmers are also more diverse farmers. Basically, this is when you look at species richness, this is from a study that was done at the global level by Riccardi and colleagues in 2017. It was published in Global Food Security. And you can see here the size of the farm. So this is in hectares, going from 0.1 to 1,000 hectares, basically. And you can see that the percent of richness of those farms decline as the farmers get bigger. So larger farms, less diverse than small-scale farms. Also, there's a lot of accumulating evidence that diversification increase biodiversity, of course, but also the multiple ecosystem services that are provided by that biodiversity without compromising yields, which is important, no? Because there's always this idea that with this diverse farming system, they're great for biodiversity, but they're very low yielding. They don't produce enough. And this is a meta-population. This is a meta-analysis that was done by Tamburini et al. That was published a couple of years or 4 years ago. And what you can see here is that biodiversity, so this is comparing monoculture, more simplified system with diversified farming systems, no? So anything here to the right of this 0 point here represent an increase, significant increase in whatever the variable is that we're looking at. So for biodiversity, we see an increase in biodiversity with the diversification of the system, but also the ecosystem services that are provided. So pollination, pest control, nutrient cycling, water regulation, soil fertility, etc. And the important thing here is that crop yield, even though you don't have an increase in crop yield, but you don't have a decline in crop yield, which is frequently an assumption, that these diversified farming systems are great for maintaining biodiversity, but they're not good for productivity. And that is being debunked. This is just a little bit more detail where you can see diversification practices that were targeting the above ground vegetation and the diversification practices that were targeting below ground processes, no? And you can see that have similar results. And this is combining all those practices. And the question then that emerges, can small-scale farmers practicing agroecology feed the world? Well, I already gave you a hint about that by saying that you can diversify the systems without losing productivity, no? But there's, the reality is that small-scale farmers are already basically producing a lot of the food that people are eating today. So in approximately, this is from the same study by Riccardi and colleagues, in approximately 25% of the land, small-scale farmers produce between 30 to 70% of the food that we are eating today globally. And here you can see some of the graphs of that study showing this is a percentage of food production. And this is, again, the size of the farm. So here you're looking at, very small farms and moving toward very large farms. And yeah, in medium scale farms, there's some peak here of particular foods that are produced. But most of the food is produced here in this, kind of like small farms. And that is even more, it's shown much strongly when you look at the nutrients, actually. So these graphs here, the different colors represent carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And this, again, the same thing, the x-axis. This is the size of the farm, and this is the percentage of those nutrients. And you can see sharp decline, moving from the very small farms to the larger farms. And here, you can see what are those crops that are being produced, no? And you can see that the food that people are eating, cereals and fruits and pulses and roots and tubers, have very high, most of the production is in the smaller farms, no? And they decline as the farms get larger and larger. Oil crops are, produced mainly, more in the larger farms. And this is other, so there's a whole bunch of things that are included there. Okay, so moving along, basically about more than 10 years ago, Oliver De Schutter, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, wrote a report called Agroecology and the Right to Food. And in that report, he said small-scale farmers using agroecology can double food production in entire regions within 10 years while mitigating climate change, conserving biodiversity, and alleviating rural poverty. This is based on the study that he did, like a literature review at the time. And so, again, this is not something very radical. It's been said, long time ago, and people are providing the evidence that this is the case. Now, the agroecological movement that has been growing throughout the global south, but also the global north, it's important to recognize that this movement is a political movement. No, it emerged as a way of resisting neoliberal globalization. So in the 80s, in the mid 80s, throughout the 90s and 2000s, and the expansion of industrial agriculture. So it's a kind of a response to resisting that kind of push for neoliberal globalization. It's based on emancipatory politics, politics that basically seek the independence of the farmers from these global forces, the market forces. And it is strongly linked to the concept of food sovereignty that was developed by La Via Campesina, an international global umbrella organization of small-scale farmer organizations, no? Or peasant organizations. And in the Nyaleni Declaration that happened, this was a gathering organized by La Via Campesina in Mali in 2007. They essentially, the farmers themselves, the peasants that belong to La Via Campesina, came up with this concept of food sovereignty. They developed that concept that now have reached, academia, and there's a lot of papers that have been written about food sovereignty and all that, but it emerged from the grassroots. And they define it as the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture system. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of the food system and policies rather than the demands of the market and corporations. It defends the interests and inclusion of the next generation. So that's the definition that La Via Campesina gives on food sovereignty. So again, how do we move then from these kinds of landscape, which today are dominating the agricultural lands? As I mentioned before, about 70% of the land is in this kind of agriculture. How do we move from something like that to something like this? In my opinion, one of the key aspects that we need to address is land redistribution. And it has to be a fair land redistribution. That is essential. Those huge farms need to be broken down into smaller farms that are much more effective, much more productive than the large scale farms. And people are beginning to talk about this concept of agroecological territories. So it's not enough to talk about the conversion or the transformation of the farm, at the farm scale. Working at the farm scale, which many people are doing, and there are many farmers that are, working on their farms and transforming their farms to agroecological farms, but working at the farm scale alone cannot achieve the transformation that is needed. No, that transformation needs to happen at the landscape level. And there has to be an integration of farming and non-farming activities through a larger area, through this landscape level area. And the farmers then need to be organized, of course, because how else can they, construct these agroecological territories if they're working independently from one another? So they need to be organized not only among themselves, but also with the broader local food system. So, thinking about an agroecological territory is essentially talking about the landscape matrix, or the matrix that I was talking about before from an ecological perspective, but adding to that the social-political, cultural, economic structures, that will be required for the transformation of that landscape. And so I'm not sure how I'm doing in time. How much more time do I have? Massimo, how much more time do I have?
Sorry, but you have 5-10 minutes, depending on you.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just briefly, I want to just give you an example, of that transformation at the landscape level, no? And maybe perhaps, although at the time that I visited this area, they were not calling it an agroecological territory, but perhaps it is an example of the building of an agroecological territory. And I'm referring to a case study from Brazil, and in particular, the Pontal de Paranapanema. So this is the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. I'm sure that you have some Brazilians in the course. And so they might be familiar with this case study, but this is the Sao Paulo state. And this little peak here is what is called the Pontal de Paranapanema, the Paranapanema River. And what you can see here in this area, this is all cattle ranching. And there is a relatively large reserve called Morro del Diablo State Park. And then the Morro del Diablo State Park also include these other kind of smaller patches that are kind of distributed along this landscape, which again is cattle pasture. And then there are these darker green areas here are patches of forest that are being maintained, in the area, because of the law in Brazil to maintain certain proportion of your land in natural vegetation, So you have that that situation with a relatively large park, and then these patches of natural vegetation, of forest, embedded in a matrix that looks something like this. So here you can see this is the border of the reserve here, and this is cattle pasture. And this is cattle pasture with hardly any trees in it. And a lot of it is, degraded, basically very, very low diversity in these areas. And so the MST, Movimiento dos Trabajadores Rurais Sem Terra, the landless movement in Brazil, has settlements in those areas. So the MST is engaged in peaceful resistance and protests that basically, to some extent, force the Brazilian government to redistribute land for them. So these are landless people that are embedded in a struggle for acquiring land. And through the actions of the MST, 7.5 million hectares of agricultural land have been distributed to 350 families in Brazil. In this, and they are engaged in agroecological education. So they have agroecological schools, so the farmers can learn how to do agroecology. They have agroecological markets. For example, this is arroz ecológico, etcétera, etcétera, no? And that the idea for that is to provide greater stability, improvement in income for the farming families and living conditions, and strengthening local economies. And so when I was living in Brazil, I lived in Brazil in like around 2006, 2007. And I visited this area with a friend of mine that works in IPE, which is an Instituto de Pesquisas Agroecológicas, and essentially is a conservation institute that is working hand in hand with the MST. So this is an asentamiento of the MST. These are people that have not received land yet and are basically waiting for land to be allocated to them. And this is Jefferson Lima, who works for the MST. So here you see the collaboration between the social movement. La Vía Campesina, MST is a member of La Vía Campesina in the organization I mentioned before, and the and Jefferson is from the IPE, no, the environmental organization, and they're working hand in hand to basically diversify their farming systems. Now, all these yellow areas that you see here are asentamientos del MST, settlements of the MST. So these are big areas here that where the MST have managed to get the government to allocate land to the landless peasant families. And in those areas is where Jefferson is working and basically promoting agroforestry. They're developing nurseries to plant more trees, basically, fruit trees, as well as trees that are nitrogen fixing trees that improve the soils, et cetera, et cetera. This is a small patch of coffee that initially people were planting it in monoculture, but then began planting trees, and now our agroforestry systems. And so the landscape is beginning to change. So that entire landscape, which was completely devoid of trees, very, very degraded area, now is beginning to look more forested. Obviously, this is a very long process. This is not something that happened from one year to the next, but you can see the changes that are going. This is a little patch of forest, and then surrounding that patch of forest is an agroforestry system from one of the settled MST families. So going from something that like these pastures that were, basically devoid of any other vegetation, now the system is beginning to look something like this. So here you have agroforestry systems that were established by the MST families. You have here surrounding this area of forest also an area that seemed high, that is in the process of being reforested, et cetera, no? When they're practicing agroecological systems, they stop using pesticide, which is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. So just by stopping the use of pesticide is a big improvement. Although in this area, the pastures don't use a lot of pesticides, so maybe herbicides, I'm not sure. But the point here is that this social movement is beginning to construct an agroecological territory, because it's not just about the ecological aspect, it's also about the connection between land and people, but also among people and the different components of the food system. That includes the vendors of fruits and vegetables, the little grocery store, the bakery, all the people that are distributing food in that region, and the producers of food and the consumers of food. So all of that is included, in the agroecological territory. So the point here, and just to finish, is that the political struggle for food sovereignty is part of the struggle to preserve biodiversity. And in my opinion, even though there's a lot of bad things happening in the world, and industrial agriculture continue growing, I think there's a lot of hope. And the hope is brought in by these organizations, peasant farmers, that are trying to basically change their living conditions. And by changing their living conditions, they're improving the environment for all of us. And with that, I'm going to stop here and opening it for questions. Let me stop sharing so that I can see you all. Okay, there you go.
Many thanks, Yvette, for your presentation. I think it's very important because you start from a very strong ecological and biological foundation. I think it's very interesting, important, because sometimes the debate about food sovereignty, agroecology, it look like just as a political point of view. Okay, there is the political dimension, but you show how all the elements are connected. Biodiversity, ecological dimension, the land right. I think it's very important that the land distribution. The unequal land distribution is part of the destruction of biodiversity, environmental impacts. And also all the connection, different issues, and the connection between food sovereignty and climate justice and environmental quality. I think this is very important. I let the floor now to Elena and Daniele to move in the classroom with the microphone. If you have a question, please take the opportunity to share this issue, because I think in a very good way, Yvette may give you a very important summary of the key element of the stacks, and especially the critical approach to land sparing, because we, in a colonization way, we think we have a place where we can do everything and a place where we forbid to do everything. And the idea, protected areas and the place in which you can make pollution, destruction of biodiversity, etc. So to change this framework is very important.
Okay, do we have any question? Okay, one question here.
Hello, Professor Ivette Perfecto. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm Sifa Tasria from Bangladesh. My question is actually something that you presented this case study of MST from Brazil. And I think this is a very necessary initiative, because over the years, we have lost this nature to people connection. So do you think that such initiatives which foster people to nature connection throughout the world, do you see any trend that such initiatives are growing? Or like you ended the presentation with the word of hope. So can we hope more on that perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, definitely. I think that not only in terms of the work that's been going on with organizations like La Via Campesina, that for them is not only about production of food, it's also about conservation of nature, and conservation of biodiversity. So they're very much invested in, an approach that conserve biodiversity, but also the conservationists are beginning to realize that that's the best way to conserve is by establishing this partnership with the people that are using the land, rather than kicking them out and preserving it, without the intervention of people. Most of the biodiversity that we have today left in the world reside in areas that are being managed mostly by indigenous people. And they have managed to maintain that biodiversity much more effectively than any of the land reserves and places where people have been excluded. And so those kinds of partnerships, I think, are becoming more common. And, I criticize the 30 by 30 just because I think that the people that were, well, mainly because, not that I am against the areas that are already in conservation. I mean, I think that there are areas in conservation all over the world, whether they have been declared a conservation area or not. There are a lot of areas that are in conservation, and those, we don't need to intervene with those areas. We don't need to do anything with those areas. We don't need to expand those areas either, because there are many communities that are maintaining the biodiversity, in those areas. And so I think that in general, even conservation biologists and conservation organizations are becoming aware of how important it is to form this partnership. And there are very few conservationists, I would say these days, that are still insisting on excluding people. They are still, and they are very vociferous, and they are very powerful as well. And they probably have the most money as well. And so you hear a lot about that in the media. But there are also a lot of people that are convinced that you cannot conserve biodiversity by just excluding people. And so, yeah, I am very hopeful about that.
Okay, we have another question.
Well, a question that I like to ask, and one and always I ask myself because I don't have the answer yet, is who should pay for biodiversity? In the book Farmers Bounty, which explore the origins of biodiversity, a relationship is established, not a causal one, but it's true that in places with higher biodiversity, there are lower levels of development. This isn't just limited to economic development, but also include fewer opportunities of education, lower life expectancy, and even food security. There is this paper, Rich in Agrobiodiversity but Poor in Nutrition, challenges in improving food security in the Chopca communities in Huancavelica, that points out that the Chopca community has a lot of biodiversity, especially in potato. But they also face poverty and malnutrition. Often, the alternative for farmers isn't to produce more or in a different way, is simply to migrate. So my question is, who is right now paying for biodiversity? And if the answer is the farmers, why should they?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is no doubt that in areas where you have very high levels of biodiversity, there is not all the areas, but a lot of areas where there's a lot of high biodiversity. There's also a high level of poverty. But that has nothing to do with the conservation of biodiversity. I think it has more to do with the policies that are implemented. In many places, there's no incentive for the small scale, no support for small scale farmers. And so I think there are ways that we can actually increase the livelihoods or increase in terms of the, improve, let's say, the livelihoods of people that live in rural areas without necessarily going the normal route of development, which would be, inserting those farmers into the global market, getting them to produce, crops for export so that they can make money. No, I think that part of the problem that we have is this conception of development that it implies all the time economic growth, when it is not necessarily the case that people are more happy with higher economic growth. Of course, you don't want poverty. People need to have enough money to be able to have a dignified living, etc. But those are matters of policies and how the government is organized. It has nothing to do with the biodiversity, conservation or not conservation of biodiversity. So I don't think that is necessarily the case, or it should be the case, that higher areas of higher biodiversity have to be poor. And so I think that if the government develop policies that will help those communities that have high biodiversity, that strengthen the local economies, of those communities, not necessarily link them to international or national markets. That's, sometimes that might work, but sometimes it's not necessarily the case. What I'm against is like having this perception that that's the way to get people out of poverty. And so, I'm not sure I answer your question directly, but I think I did answer it indirectly.
Okay, we have a few other questions.
Hello, Professor Perfecto. Thank you so much for the information shared. I'm Fernanda from Peru. I wanted to ask 3 things. The first one is, I am interested to know the resource of the information when you said we produce enough food. Is it true? And if it's true, how can we show that for politically in the political spaces? I mean, with authorities, how do we show them or convince them that we are actually producing more? The second question, it's about the agroecology. It's true that it's not just a technique, it's also a political movement. So when we share these success cases, maybe we should also notice that where does these cases of success come from? Who are the organization or the people that are leading these cases? And those are not people from other territories, they're from the same territory. So maybe that's also why these are cases of success. Maybe it's because of the struggle of the people from the same territory. It belongs to the people that are suffering in that space. So when NGOs or other organizations from other countries even go to their places, they join that agenda, but they do not impose. And that's something that I think it's a critic to some NGOs that believe that, oh, this is the formula for every territory, and do not actually join their own processes. So do you think, or I would like to hear you more about if this is just like a formula that everyone can make in any territory, in any time, to transform that territory, or maybe it's more like join what the people are doing or struggling about. And the third one, it's what you already talked about, development. What is development? Maybe for different territories, it means something totally different, right? So maybe it's not about development, maybe it's, do we have the organization as people who share the same territories to create our own way of living, of good living? So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. A lot of good questions. So your first question was about food production. Are we producing enough food to feed the world? Well, the United Nations have recognized that. You know, there are reports from the United Nations that say that we indeed produce more food than we are consuming, that we need to consume. There are a lot of problems that are related. There's a lot of issues, that some of that food goes to feed animals and cars, biofuel. So, you know, the corn that is produced, soybeans, etc., go to feed animals instead of people. That's one thing. We also have a lot of waste of food. So people have been beginning to pay more attention to that, to the waste of food. And that happens in different ways in different countries. And so we need to really pay more attention to that. But the thing is that a lot of the food that is being produced in this very extensive, I didn't show a map that I wanted to show, but then I decided to take it out for the sake of time. But essentially it has the areas that produce fuel and feed for animals, and the areas that produce actual food that people eat. And you can see the concentration of the areas that are producing food in the global south, and it's mainly small-scale farmers. And the areas that are producing, that have these plantations, monoculture plantations with a lot of agrochemicals and all that, are producing primarily feed and fuel and oils for the industry and things like that. So yes, we produce enough food, even if you count into it the food that goes to feed the animals, because part of some people eat the animals, and some of the food that is wasted and all that, there's still enough food that is produced to feed the world. It's a matter of accessibility, of poverty, essentially, that people don't have enough money to buy that food. And unfortunately, most of the areas where people are going hungry are in rural areas. Farmers are going out of business. Small-scale farmers are going out of business because the governments are not basically supporting that kind of agriculture. So a lot of the support go to these larger scale farms that are industrial farms, essentially. And so the farming families basically go out of business. They lose their farm, they migrate to the city, and they live in poverty in the cities. Or they become farm workers for the bigger farms and live in poverty that way. So there are numerous studies, and I show you some of those. I show you the study by Riccardi that show that small-scale farms are actually producing a lot of the food. And so that's important, because those farmers are producing food usually for the local economy. They're producing food for the local region, and that food is being consumed right there, in those regions. And so that kind of contribute to the development of those regions. And if you have those areas being converted, or the industrial agriculture expanding into those areas that have more small-scale farmers, and displacing them, then you don't have basically the production. A lot of the production that that occur in those farms go out of the region, and so economic opportunities are lost, etc., etc. So that's the first question. The second question, and I already forgot what your second question was about. Can you, in a nutshell, repeat it again? Just
yeah,
I will remember as soon as you say something about it.
it was about the seeing the agroecology as a formula for every territory in every moment, and not just a way that the territorial organizations have after a very complex process. So like, I wanted to ask you more about your opinions and also your experience when you see these cases of success. It's not about just the agroecology is the perfect formula for everything, but it's because the complex processes those territories already have, and the external actors just join them and not impose an agenda.
Yeah, and sometimes they're not even, the external actors might be, that these farmers are members of La Via Campesina and they go to meetings representing the region. They go to meetings of a particular commission. There's an agroecology commission in La Via Campesina. So they could be going to a meeting there, meeting other farmers and getting ideas from those farmers. But everything is essentially, kind of coming from the grassroots. There are situations where the farmers that are organizing at the local level have support from organizations. And of course, if there are organizations that are willing to support their efforts, I think that's great, and they should be able to use that support as long as they are not imposing, these organizations are not imposing their own views of how those communities should be developing. But the process of territorialization of agroecology is, as you mentioned, is a very complex process. I think one way in which La Via Campesina is doing that is by having the farmer to farmer methodology and having these schools of agroecology that are not just about how you produce food, but it are also about, the social political aspect, how you become more independent of those forces, external forces. And the concept, I don't know if you've seen the paper by Giraldo and Rosset, Emancipatory Agroecology, is a really good paper. I highly recommend it because they talk about this concept of emancipatory agroecology and what are the components of an emancipatory agroecology. So agroecology is not just about, producing food in an ecological way, but it's about emancipation of the rural sector. And human beings in general, because we all also are part of the food system, because we also consume the food that's being produced. So that interconnection of people and developing political structures that will allow these communities to be able to have a dignified living in the context of a very oppressive society and a very oppressive system that is a capitalist system that is extracting as much as they can and sometimes even displacing people from their own lands. I think that there's a lot of strength, in having a political movement that is offering a way for these communities to resist. And so it's a complicated process. There are examples, and some I gave from the MST, which is a huge organization, and so it has power in numbers as well, because the MST is probably the largest social movement in Brazil, certainly, and one of the largest in the world. And so, it has the political power to be able to pressure the government also to do certain things for the benefit of the people. And the third question, again, what was it?
Okay, you already talked a little bit about it, but
Oh,
is,
development.
do we have the organization to create our own way of living? I mean, what are the limitations for us as territories that we have to be beyond them to have that conversation? Because sometimes it's very difficult to have consensus with so many different organizations struggling in the context of climate crisis and neoliberalism dictatorship in our own governments.
Yeah, I think I talk a little bit about that, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that varies depending on where you are and the particular situation. So it's kind of difficult for me to think about ways in which that can be done. And I, I collaborate sometimes with La Via Campesina, but I don't have that experience, of the struggle that people in those communities have. So I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay. Do we have okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Ivette Patrick from Rwanda. And yeah, first of all, thank you for informative lecture. Actually, I do agree that in the juniors, people manage to protect the diversity, but in some places in the globe, we are facing the problem of population growth. And now it's become a challenge to manage the resources we have because it's becoming much more scarce. So I wanted to come back to the proposition you were saying about land redistribution and ask if actually for a better territorial management, we can't think about land consolidation so that we can much more exploit what we have. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure I understood the question. So you're asking whether the land, I don't know. Can somebody summarize, or can you,
Yeah,
explain it
actually, I can
little
just
bit?
summarize. It's like about land redistribution you were talking about.
Uh-huh.
And because of that challenge of population growth, if we can't think about land consolidation so that we can best manage our territory.
With land conservation?
Yeah, land consolidation.
Oh, land consolidation.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of examples of that. I think that I need a little bit more of an explanation of what do you mean by land consolidation? If you mean like people, let's say larger farmers being able to buy more land from their neighbors and getting bigger and bigger. So that's a process of land consolidation that happens, and there are a lot of examples of that happening in the world. But whether that has anything then to do with the potential conservation of biodiversity, I'm not sure. I think that what you're implying, and maybe I'm wrong, is that the process of conservation can be done through land consolidation? Is that, or no?
Okay, maybe I can explain much more. For example, in the country I come, in Rwanda, the population growth is coming much more. So how people they are using land, actually it's become problem because they are searching land for building, land for agriculture. So it's like when you are talking about the land redistribution, or a huge number of population, sometimes it's become tricky.
Yeah, now I understand.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So you're talking about increasing the population.
Yeah.
And yes, okay. Yeah, well, that is problematic in less and less so and in less places in the world. I understand that in your country, it is a problem. However, in most countries in the world, fertility is going down, and it's actually decline. The number of people are beginning to decline. The United Nations is predicting a big decline in the population, and countries are beginning to worry about big decline in the population, because you need people to to develop to some extent. But it is a reality in some parts of the world, definitely. And I don't know in your country, you say you're from Rwanda? So
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
know. Yeah, I don't know if in Rwanda you have a huge uneven distribution of land. But one way to do the land distribution would be to take the land from those very huge, large farmers or areas that are that have been taken over by large corporations or large farmers, and redistribute that land. But one thing that we have seen over and over again in a lot of throughout the world, throughout history, is that with more economic development, we have lower of fertility. With more education of women, we have lower fertility. And so the population increase start leveling off and declining to some extent when there's more education for women, when there's more accessibility to resources, to education, and to jobs, etc., etc. So that is nothing to do with agriculture, but to some extent, it's one approach that has been taken in some other parts of the world. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about the issue, but it's not like everybody in Rwanda has very small pieces of land, no? There must be some very large farms in Rwanda. So I think that taking a deeper look at the distribution of the land, how the land is distributed, could show that there are ways in which land can be redistributed and still have people that are producing food for the local population, no?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry that I didn't get that from the beginning.
Okay, other questions?
Hi, Ivette. Thank you
Hola.
very much for your presentation. Just a little question. If it exists a good example of, in the logic of political modern national states, by the, I don't know, status quo with land redistribution, or it's hypothetical? Because, well, I came from Chile, and when in the status quo's way to redistribution land, well, the president was killer, and over than 4,000 people in a country from, I don't know, 10 million. So I think it's not so clear the example in Chile, because they don't get over than 3 years the redistribution of the land, but maybe in around the world, I don't know, could be a good example now. Thank you.
There are not actually a lot of really good examples of land redistribution that is fair. I think there have been, obviously, there are, historical cases of land distribution. For example, the Mexican Revolution, part of the Mexican Revolution, that it was a lot about land. And they established some laws that say, okay, you cannot have more than 300 hectares. Nobody can have more than 300 hectares of land. And of course, the application of that then in reality, well, it varies from place to place. The land redistribution in Mexico didn't reach the southern state of Chiapas, for example, until much, much, much later, and it's still dominated by fairly large farms. So another kind of land redistribution that I saw that happened relatively in recent times, not that recent, but in contemporary times, was in Cuba, which when the fall of the Soviet Union occurred in the 80s, in the 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, essentially a lot of the large state farms were broken down and distributed to the workers that used to be workers in those state farms and became farmers associated into cooperatives. So that actually have a very positive effect. It didn't happen in all sectors of agriculture in Cuba. There's still some very large state farms in Cuba, but they managed to break down a lot of the very inefficient state farms in a lot of parts of Cuba. It was very problematic, and not problematic, but it was very difficult to get people that used to be workers in a large state farm to start thinking and behaving like farmers. You have to make decisions on your own. You have to know how to make those decisions. And they didn't have that tradition because they had been workers on a farm and didn't have to think that much about what they were doing because they were being told what to do all the time. And so it took a lot of training. It took a lot of effort to get people to start thinking more as independent farmers or peasant producers than workers in a farm. But those are two examples of land redistribution. There have been a lot of land redistribution throughout Latin America with not a really great record for the most part. The Sandinista revolution started some land redistribution as well, but again, that wasn't that successful either.
Yeah, just a little question before that. So in the Chilean case and in the Cuban case, obviously it's between the Marxist way to do the things, and Marxists, I read, doesn't give nature or lands or fields power and rights. So they use and they see and they exploit the land as a natural resource. So maybe can we talk just a little bit about ideas from workers or farmers or campesinos around the world with Marxist ideas, but with giving, I don't know, rights to the land, like, ethnical communities or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody there is from Bolivia, but in Bolivia, when Morales was elected president, there were Marxist tendencies, or at least socialist tendencies, and the constitution changed to give rights to Mother Earth, and they talk about el buen vivir as part of the the constitution, and so obviously there are developments in that area. At the same time, they were exploiting petroleum, continue to exploit petroleum in the forest, in the Amazon region. So there are contradictions, definitely. But there are examples, and there's a new tendency, at least in academia, of Marxism that is much more ecological. There are people that are beginning to talk about degrowth from a Marxist perspective as well. So there are kind of like a new left that is a new ecological or environmental left that is much more conscious about the rights of the land and non-human beings. And so all those are very interesting, but you know, it's just right now it's just at the theoretical level, basically. But definitely there you know, indigenous communities that like the Zapatistas is a good example of indigenous communities that have very high respect for the land and are doing agroecological practices and are involved in the movement for agroecology. But they're still very poor. So I don't know if you have visited any Zapatista communities in Chiapas, in Mexico, but they're still very poor. However, they have kind of a dignity, and they have a way of living that is perceived by themselves as an emancipatory process. You know, they feel like they are in control of their own lives, which is an important component, you know, of a dignified living. And so they are poor materially speaking, but they're very rich in tradition, in dignity, and those other concepts that are much harder to measure.
Okay, we have another question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. You spoke about agroecology and its importance for biodiversity, since it's reduced the use of fertilizers and pesticides. However, these practices will lower the productivity of the lands and make the prices higher for people, and make these products not accessible to everyone. So is there any solutions to make the prices lower for people who has lower income?
Yeah, first of all, as I mentioned before, agroecological systems can be highly productive. And in many cases, they are actually more productive than the large-scale monocultural systems, because, you know, at least these very large-scale systems, there's a lot of waste and inefficiencies that are built into these systems. So in terms of land, you know, productivity per land is actually very well understood, that smaller scale farms are more productive than larger scale farms, no? And so I'm confounding here the scale and the agroecology, but for the most part, the smaller scale, the agroecological farms are smaller scale farms. And so there is this thing called the inverse size productivity relationship that had been established long time ago. Actually, Amartya Sen, the Indian economist that won the Nobel Prize in 1998 or something like that, he was the first to talk about this inverse land size productivity relationship. Larger farms are less productive than smaller farms. And all agricultural economists are well aware of this inverse relationship. There are a lot of debates as to why that happens. And so you can find in the literature a lot of debate about that. But the fact that there's that inverse relationship is not being contested. That's number one. Number two, the price of food. So food is, the price of food is so distorted, mostly because there are a lot of externalities. So the reason that that food that is produced in very large scale industrial farm is so cheap is because of the externalities, because the damage that is done to the environment is not paid by them, it's paid by society at large. The damage that is done to the workers in terms of health issues and to the consumers in terms of health issues is not paid by them, is paid by society at large, no? It's paid by others. And by externalizing all those costs that should be internal of that production system, they can sell the food really cheap. That's the second point. The third point, to finalize, the third point is that cheap food policy actually is something that was established to benefit the industrial sector. The industrial sector needed people to be able to afford to buy cheap food in order to work for the industry, and the industry didn't have to pay a lot of money. So this comes from way, way back during the Industrial Revolution. And so the idea, that idea kind of remained that we should have food, we should have cheap food. But if you think about it, most of the poor people in the world are farmers. They should not be receiving very low price for their effort, for all their labor. On the contrary, they should be getting, a decent pay for the food that they're producing. And if they're producing it agroecologically, they should be receiving a decent, livelihood for being able to produce this food in an agroecological fashion. Now, obviously, people need to afford to buy food. And there are now, because of the distortion of a lot of migration to the cities, because people couldn't afford to live as farmers, they moved to the cities, and now they live in the city and need cheap food. So that cheap food policy has been maintained. But there are many programs that can go, instead of subsidizing these large-scale farms that are damaging the environment, the health of people, et cetera, subsidize the food for the people that can't afford to buy it, no? It's just a shift in the subsidies of the government. And so it's just a matter of how you structure your economy and who the policies of the government are supposed to benefit. And right now, those policies are benefiting the industrial sector, are benefiting the large-scale farmers, but not the small-scale farmers.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Okay. No, maybe we have another question.
I would like you to share more about how the cheapest prices were thinked to the convenience for the industry of large scale farmers, or the food industry more hegemonic, because I heard years ago that it was there were a farmer that burned himself alive because he couldn't compete with the prices of the industrial businesses. So, and the Via Campesina had this critic to the TLCs about that. So maybe you can share more about this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, that was during a meeting of the WTO in Cancun, where actually no, this he didn't burn himself, but he immolated himself. This was a Korean farmer. I don't know about the person that burned himself, but yeah, I mean there is the cheap food policies have been standard policy of most countries, because they obviously when people don't have enough food to eat, they go out in the street. And, all those protests that you saw in 2008, maybe you were very young at that time, but in 2008, it was a food crisis because the price of food went up for a variety of reasons that, complicated, but the price of food went up and people were, up in arms in the streets all over the world, protesting these high food prices. And so it is an issue in the cities, in areas with a high urban population, it is an issue, and the governments have to develop programs to deal with that, no? Now, one example that I would encourage you all to read about is the example of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, and the initial policies that led to the Fome Zero program, Zero Hunger program. That program started in Belo Horizonte, the city of Belo Horizonte. And the program, basically, the mayor of the city decided that he was going to use about 1 or 2% of the budget of the city to make stronger connection between the farmers in the periphery of the city and the consumers in the city, and develop all these programs to essentially be able to provide a high price for the farmers, eliminating all the intermediaries, because the city was the one who actually bought the food from the farmers directly, and established these what were called the socolons, which were like stores where you buy the fresh produce by the pound. So you know, if you needed an onion, 3 garlic cloves, and 2 sweet potatoes, you put them all in a bag and you weigh them, and you pay for the weight, you know, for how much that weighted. And it was relatively cheap. So you can still afford to have provide cheap produce to the people in the city and be able to pay a relatively high price to the farmers. And this program that initiated in Belo Horizonte, in the city of Belo Horizonte, which has, I don't know, maybe 5 million people or something like that. It's a fairly large city. This program in Belo Horizonte, in a few years, they managed to reduce infant mortality by a very, very large percentage, just by very simple programs that reduce, that consume at the most 2% of the budget of the city. And so they basically were on their way of eliminating hunger in the city, basically, with these very simple programs that did not require to pay farmers a very low price for their food, but paying farmers a dignified price for their food, so that they could actually have a dignified living.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? No? Okay.
Perfect. If there is no more question, good. We close by 5 o'clock as it was planned. Many thanks to Ivette also for this part of question and answer. I think we can enter in detail. We enter in detail of some topics. Many thanks. We prepared a bibliography in our repository with some documents, so you can deepen this element. And many thanks again, Ivette, to stay with us, and have a good morning, I think.
Yes. Well, no, it's yeah, good morning. Yeah, it's still morning here, 11 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for your questions. They were wonderful questions, and made me think a lot about these issues. But I hope that that I gave you some food for thought.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ivette.
Yeah.
Have a nice day.
Goodbye.
Ciao.
You
Goodbye.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Okay.
Okay.